in this next section, which is maximising potential through positive player welfare focus. And just to introduce this topic, we'll have a look at a video of Jerry Manuel, the former MLB manager, speaking out about player-coach relationships.
I think we sometimes don't realize the impact that coaches have on youth. Therefore, that means that we have to have our stuff together, so to speak. For me, it's to keep the kid involved, it's to make it fun, and hopefully he learns some life lessons along the way. And I've always said that rules without a relationship equal rebellion. So I'm always one in trying to build that relationship, trying to build that trust, and then set guidelines as to what a young man can do and cannot do. But it's important that as mentors of youth sports today, that we have to take that serious, because we are molding and grooming the next generation, and that's very important.
Liam, can you just put this into context for us in terms of player welfare? Like, how does it actually help performance?
Yeah, look, how you communicate with your players is critically important. I suppose ultimately you're trying to, like, every player is, you have a responsibility when you take over a player at any level, whether it be under 12 or whatever, right up to national or to intercounty, is that you want to make sure that that player is able to fulfil their potential all of the time on a consistent basis. So, I think, I guess when I was a player myself years ago, I mean, literally the communication was very much in group context. It was fired down to us and we took it, whether it be good or bad. And I think we might have seen some of that earlier on with Paddy when Jeffrey was going through the slide. But it's changed a lot, and I think certainly one-to-one communication with players now is really, really important, where you get to understand what's going on. And I suppose ultimately, you've got to be really positive. But what I've learned over the years, and I did learn, and you have to learn this. I mean, I would have walked into training sessions where there was a player who maybe hadn't played the weekend or wasn't playing, and if he walked towards the water bottles, my instant reaction would have been to walk the other way because he's not in a good space. I completely have changed my tack now, and I think, you've got to take on the communication. You've got to make sure that there should nothing come as a surprise to a player. But I think how you communicate to them is really, really important. But the most important thing in communication is that a player will remember everything you said to them. And if you give them a negative message, it'll take a long, long time to get that out of the player's head. So if you walk into any one-to-one situation, or if you communicate with a player in a given session and you say something that impacts them, that's going to really hurt them for a period of time. So my communication was always prepared, and was really about trying to see, can I get a message across to let them understand where I see them and how important they are to the overall scheme of things, and what role I see them playing. And let them know honestly, you can't lie to players. Players are too smart now. If you try and, if there's weeds in the grass, there's weeds in the grass, and you got to get that message across. But it's how you convey the message. But certainly how you communicate with players will certainly enhance performance. And, you've got to try and find the things that, always try and find players to catch them doing things right. And build and build and build. And Maureen Gaffney wrote a fabulous book, Flourishing. And she said, if you want a young child to flourish, and I always say this to underage coaches, if you want a child to flourish at something, you've got to give them 7 positives to one area of improvement. And I think if your coaching strategy and your communication strategy, if you build it on that platform, that's a great starting point.
And I suppose the question is how you actually go about building those relationships. Cian, you might have been doing that over the past few months, so I think it's a relevant question for yourself.
Yeah, I think back to what Liam said, honesty is definitely the way forward. I don't think any player likes to be told one thing and then hear from a different player or from a different member of management even, which has happened quite extensively over my years involved in coaching, from talking to players. The one thing they hate more than anything is just that lack of depth of conversation with a manager, with a coach, or the lack of truth in terms of, hearing one thing and then being told something different. So I think if you initiate that relationship and that protocol with your players very early on, trust can only work both ways. And you begin to trust the players begin to trust you, and everything should flourish, from that perspective onwards. And I think it doesn't always need to be a structured conversation. One thing I've learned by working with players over years, and obviously being a teacher by trade, is that sometimes it's the off the cuff, 2-minute chat or conversation in the middle of a session, on the phone on the way home from a session, before the warm-up. Sometimes they can be as important, if not more important, than actually arranging to meet a player, whether it's got to do with team selection or got to do with discipline, whatever the case may be. They actually just appreciate that as much as anything more formalised, you know. And I think there's ways of doing that more and more often. With the way technologies are there now, I don't think you should ever skip a beat in terms of the importance of the human side of things. But you have communication tools out there which make the very complex job of a manager a lot easier now. We've been very fortunate in Kildare. I had it in Kerry using MetriFit, which is a player monitoring tool whereby the players can communicate with you every day via looking at psychometric data, sleep quality, sleep duration, stress levels, diet, muscle soreness. And what that means is that by 11 or 12 o'clock every day, I have 6 invaluable pieces of information for every single player in the squad. And in some cases, if you know they're doing exams and their stress levels are 4 out of 5, you know, you accept that, you're not worrying because you know they're in the middle of their college exams. But if there's not a particular reason, well then that might be you making a phone call at 12 o'clock in the day when their stress levels are highest, as opposed to waiting 2 or 3 days later to the next training session to actually connect with them. So I think there's a role for technology there. It should never supersede the human element, but it always comes back to communication, and equally important for me is education. If the players are educated as to the importance of communication from their end, I think that'll definitely improve things. One of the biggest problems I have at the moment, being a new manager with a new set of players, everyone trying to impress, is that they just won't tell you how sore, how tired, how potentially injured they may be, because they're trying to force, or what they think they're doing is forcing their way onto a squad. Whereas we, as a management team, would just much prefer for them to tell us where they're at physically, mentally, so we can pull them, we can release them, stay at home with your wife, with your family, and then come back the next night and you're in a more optimal position to perform. And as a result, to be very honest, I'd say we have at least 8 players now, 8, who have, you know, small soft tissue type injuries, similar to the ones that Edwina's talked about, non-contact, simply because they forced themselves through a session or through a match. And being a new manager, you know, that's frustrating because you're still trying to get to know what makes them tick, you know. So the education part in addition to the communication.
Just very quickly, Ross, on that discussion as well, what are players actually looking for in a coach?
Yeah, I think the 2 lads have nailed it there. I was thinking about that question yesterday evening, and the 2 words that came to mind are honesty and trust. And as Liam says, you will remember every single statement that a manager makes to you. And sometimes players will read more into certain statements than others. So that's obviously crucial. And then the other bit as well is the trust part, to know that the management are there looking out for me. Back when Mikko used to be with Laois, and Cian mentioned this a couple of seconds ago, sometimes it's the 30-second conversation at the side of a drill where he might have a quick chat with you, let you know I'm watching your flying and training, and all of a sudden, you know, you get a different lease of life and you feel you're going to achieve something more than you had done. And, you know, certainly having played through a lot of managers in Laois, you know, guys like Justin McNulty and Tommaso Flaherty, you knew that no matter what you told them or whatever other lads in the team would tell them, that they would respect that confidentiality. And, you know, I remember one time I had a disagreement with Justin, and, you know, maybe with other managers at club level and things like that everyone would find out about it. But for as long as Justin was coaching us, and even to this day, no other player was ever able to say back to me, oh, I heard you were arguing over this or that or whatever. That kind of thing is what might seem you mightn't think of it as a coach, but for a player to be able to have that trust in you, or to be able to say I'm having trouble with the wife, or the kids are unwell, or, you know, situation where work is not going well, I'm in a bit of bother, to be able to disclose that, like what Cian is saying, knowing that nobody else is going to find out about it inside the group or outside the group, and to trust in the manager to know he will help me resolve this and I'll be back on track sooner rather than later. And there, again, we're coming back to the trust and the honesty. We had Glenn Ryan over the club last year, And again, a similar type situation. If you're under pressure with work, there's no problem, sort it out. And then there's other occasions, lads missing training for fashion shows, and rightly, they're hung out to dry in front of the group. So it's about having that. It's about having that mix and knowing with a manager that I can trust you and you're after my best interests. And if you have 30 players on a squad, believe in that, then you're going to move forward very positive as a group, and the players will reward that to the manager with their adherence to everything that goes on in the group. I'll give one last example. Paul earlier, I was talking to him there earlier on, when we were going over to Australia in 2014 for the international rules, and the doc was on that test as well. Nobody ever had to speak about drink or going out or anything like that before the test. But because you had a manager who was open and honest and straight, you knew what was acceptable and what wasn't. And to a man, you have a situation where everybody respects, okay, there's a right thing to do and a wrong thing to do. And because you know the stance of the manager and he's very clear-cut, straight down the middle, there's no grey areas, you know how to behave. And I think that's what players want to know, what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, unfortunately. It's been fascinating, but just one quick tweet that we got in that I want to put to Kevin is just about the main dangers of concussion, because I don't think we actually touched on them earlier on. I think it's an important note to close on.
I'll reassure you first, and then I'll frighten you. The vast majority of concussions in adult male players, when diagnosed and managed appropriately, are a once-off phenomenon, and there are no sequelae. However, you must be very vigilant. If you're dealing with a player who's recently been concussed, or a player who has a history of concussion, underage players or female players, they are a vulnerable group. Their symptoms will be more severe, more prolonged, and they're more liable to get long-term problems. For example, if you're dealing with an underage group at this point in time, and they get concussed and they're not managed appropriately, then they may have problems with their study and their examinations, and they may not reach their potential. This particular group are also prone to developing what's known as the second impact syndrome. And very simply, that is where a second brain injury occurs when the first one hasn't resolved. And if this happens, the brain swells, it's inevitably fatal. There's absolutely nothing that can be done about it. And no later than 1 month ago, a female rugby player in the UK died from second impact syndrome. Everybody is probably familiar with the case of Ben Robinson in the north. And the final concern is that if you have a player who has been concussed and who's been knocked out, that player not alone should be removed from the field of play, but should be taken to a hospital for assessment, because they probably require a 24-hour period of observation, because they may be developing a clot on the surface of the brain, something called an extradural hematoma. The big problem with this is that initially the player appears to be fine for the first 3, 4, 5 or 6 hours. There are lots of reports of players collapsing on the bus on the way home or in the pub that night. And this condition is fatal as well if not managed appropriately. So it's all about vigilance.
Great stuff. So unfortunately, that's where we have to leave it for the Player Welfare Forum. Can I get a big round of applause for Ger Ryan, Liam Sheedy, Dr. Cian O'Neill, Ross Munnelly, Dr. Edwina O'Malley and Mr. Kevin Moran.